Week 14 of the fantasy football season. Here's the top 36 receivers I'm ranking this week. Number 1, Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. So this week, a great matchup at the Dallas Cowboys. Ja'Marr Chase, the best receiver in fantasy football this season. 1,100 yards, 13 touchdowns. And this week of the secondary, like the Cowboys, I think he goes out there and has one of his better games of the season. Number 2, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. So A.J. Brown, we know he's been a stud wide receiver all season long in the games he's played. And then this week with a good matchup versus the Carolina Panthers that give up points left and right. I think this Eagle team all game long is going to be up and down the field. And A.J. Brown, big-time play receiver, and he goes out there, has a big performance. Number 3, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. I know last week the numbers were down for St. Brown. He was not 100% obviously going into that shortened week for Thanksgiving. And this week, Thursday Night Football, Green Bay Packers coming to town. This could be a potential high-scoring game between two division rivals. And Amon-Ra St. Brown, we rarely see two mediocre to bad games in a row. So this week, I think he turns it around and has a nice ball game. Number 4, Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams. So this week, a decent matchup versus the Buffalo Bills. I know this Bill defense has definitely played better over the last few weeks here, and they're one of the hottest teams, obviously, in all pro football. But Puka Nacua, ever since he came back from injury, it's either a 100-yard game or he's finding the end zone. So him and Matthew Stafford are locked in. One of the best route runner and receivers in the league already. And this week, he's a top option, in my opinion. Number 5, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. So Jefferson finally had a big game last week, 7 catches, 99 yards for Justin Jefferson. So him and Sam Darnold got to get back on the same track. And this week, it's a great matchup to get it going once again with the Atlanta Falcons coming to town, where their secondary can't stop anyone. We saw last week Ladd McConkey in the first half have 100 yards in that game before he left with injury. So Justin Jefferson, hopefully he picks up where he left off last week. Number 6, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So this Buc team, all of a sudden now, they're getting things going, and obviously Mike Evans, a big part of it. So this week with a great matchup versus the Vegas Raiders that can't stop anyone through the air. And we know Baker Mayfield and Evans have been locked in since last season where Baker arrived in Tampa Bay. I think he goes out there once again, has a nice ball game. Number 7, Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. Last week he had a horrible game. No doubt about it, was Cooper Kupp, but another wide receiver where it's very rare to see him have 2 bad games in a row. So this week, not a great matchup versus the Buffalo Bills, but Cooper Kupp back home. He's played better at home than he's been on the road throughout this season here. And the Buffalo Bills, like I said, you're going to have to put points on the board to keep up with them. And I think Cooper Kupp does that this week. Number 8, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. Drake London last week, a nice ball game in a bad loss versus the Los Angeles Chargers. And Kirk Cousins, he's definitely been turning the football over early and often. But if it's one thing, he's getting the football to Drake London. And this week in Minnesota, where their secondary isn't all that great versus receivers, even though overall their defense has been good all season long. I think Drake London, he could go out there once again. Like I said, him and Kirk Cousins have been locked in for multiple weeks. And this week, like I said, a game that could be chasing points, but you can move the football as well on this Minnesota defense. I think London is in for a good ball game. Number 9, George Pickens, Pittsburgh Steelers. George Pickens, it's been a great season for him. Him and Russell Wilson are definitely locked in. And this offense is obviously reaching new heights with Wilson in there. Last week, putting up over 40 points in that ball game at the Cincinnati Bengals. And this week, another good matchup with the Browns coming to town, where they lost last week's ball game 41-32. I know the Browns beat them in that snow game in week 11, but now, if there's no weather element, it's a dry field, I think things could be different. And George Pickens and Russ just missed on some big plays in that snow game a couple weeks ago. So I think Pickens playing great football. It seems like he's finding the end zone weekly. And this week, once again, I believe he has a good game. Number 10, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. Obviously not 100% over the last few weeks. He is Lamb with a shoulder injury, but he continues to go out there and play. And this Cowboy team with 11 days off in between games, with this one being Monday night, I believe Lamb's going to go out there and he's going to be a little bit rejuvenated. And this Cowboy team's actually won 2 in a row. So this week in a matchup versus the Bengals, where they give up tons of points and they can't stop anyone, CeeDee Lamb, after a down game last week, I think bounces back. Number 11, Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. Definitely not a great season for Tyreek Hill. And obviously, this whole offense took a big hit for 6 weeks when Tua was out of the lineup. But ever since he returned, this Dolphin team's been putting points on the board, and Tyreek Hill's been getting his fantasy numbers up. Still, it's not at the elite numbers we've seen from Tyreek Hill, but this week in a matchup versus Jets secondary that's very overrated, and teams have been scoring on them all season long. I think Tyreek Hill is out there and has another good ball game. Number 12, Jakobi Meyers of the Vegas Raiders. So Jakobi Meyers, number 2 option in the passing game for this Vegas Raider team. Obviously, Brock Bowers, the impressive rookie tight end, and one of the better all-round receiving players in all football, is the number one option. But my number one wideout now ever since the Devontae Adams trade a couple months ago, and he's made the most of his opportunities. So this week in a great matchup at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I believe he's going to go out there and get his numbers. Number 13, Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. At JSN right now, he's the number one wide receiver on the Seattle Seahawks team, to me, in my opinion. So he's putting up either 100-yard ball games or finding the end zone. A dynamic second-year wide receiver. Him and Geno Smith have definitely had their rapport improve over the last few weeks, and especially the games DK Metcalf missed early in the season. So this week at Arizona, where they've been a hit-or-miss secondary this season, I think JSN goes out there once again and continues to put up good numbers. Number 14, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. So T. Higgins, it's been a great season in the games he's played as T. Higgins, but a lot of ball games he missed early in the year. But it seems like the games he's played in, he's found the end zone, or at least had 75, 80 yards. So this week in a matchup with the Cowboys, where I believe it's going to be high scoring, and we know this Cowboys secondary really can't stop anyone. I believe T. Higgins, as long as he's healthy, he's a talented wide receiver, and Cal fantasy owners week in and week out, especially on a franchise tag contract season. 15, Ladd McConkey, the Los Angeles Chargers. So Ladd McConkey, we don't know if he's going to play in this ball game. He left early on last week after the first half, and he had 100 yards already in that ball game at the Falcons. So this week in a matchup where we know they got to put points on the board is this Charger team, and most likely going to throw a lot with J.K. Dobbins out. I don't believe the running game is going to generate a lot. So if McConkey's playing, I believe he could go out there and have another successful ball game. 16, Malik Nabers of the New York Giants. So Malik Nabers, he definitely got off to a great start the first month of the season, and then getting that concussion versus the Dallas Cowboys definitely did him in, where his numbers went down. And now last week he actually got off to a good start where he didn't have 0 fantasy points in the first half. Did up with 15.3 fantasy points in last week's games. Tommy DeVito, Drew Lock, I still believe there's going to be some openings in this ball game. New Orleans secondary isn't all that great, and Tyrann Mathieu is banged up, and we don't know if he's going to play in this game as well. So Malik Nabers, I believe if he just could get off to those early starts, 15, 18 fantasy points weekly in PPR leagues, I don't believe is far-fetched. 17, Jerry Jeudy of the Cleveland Browns, are coming off a 13-catch, 235-yard receiving game, a touchdown, and a 2-point conversion. And him and Jameis just missed on a long ball early in that game where he could have had a 300-yard ball game, is Jerry Jeudy. He's been really picking things up and getting things going. And last week, I know it was a revenge game. The juice is obviously flowing, and he definitely stuck it to his old team with that monster ball game at the Denver Broncos. But this week at Pittsburgh, I think they're going to lock in on Jeudy a little bit. I still believe Judy's going to go out there, going to get his targets, going to get some numbers. But obviously, we're not going to see something like he did last week and even a couple weeks ago. I know it was a snowball game versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Jerry Jeudy's numbers were still decent, and he made some big plays in that one. 18, Jayden Reed, the Green Bay Packers. So Jayden Reed, he got back on track last week. He found the end zone twice. And this week in an indoor game, and possibly a track meet at the Detroit Lions, I think Jayden Reed once again could go out there, have a good ball game. In my opinion, one of the best yard after catch wide receivers. And also, I believe he is the number one option in this passing game. Him and Tucker Kraft and Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs are the 4 main options in this passing game. So with Romeo Doubs possibly returning, I don't think it's going to take a hit on Jayden Reed. And Jayden Reed, he just has a knack for the end zone. He just obviously needs more targets and receptions, but it seems like more weeks than not, he's finding the end zone and putting up fantasy points. 19, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. So for weeks, he wasn't doing much, but the last 2 weeks, he's getting things going as DJ Moore. Last week, he just missed out on even a bigger ball game. But Caleb Williams just missed him on a pass where if he hit more in stride, it would have been his second touchdown of the game. So last week, coming off 8 catches, 97 yards, finding the end zone. This week, it's a beatable matchup at 49ers defense that's banged up. And if it's a game they're chasing points, is a Chicago Bear team like they have over the last few weeks. DJ Moore could get a lot of garbage time and a lot of, obviously, throws they're going to be in this game where they're trying to play catch-up. 20, DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. So DK Metcalf, definitely the numbers have dropped off a little bit, but this week he's definitely due for a big ball game. And throughout his NFL career, he's obviously very familiar with this Arizona Cardinal team, versing them twice a season in the NFC West. So right now, I think he goes out there. A couple weeks ago, he didn't do much versus defense, but I think Metcalf this week bounces back has a good performance. 21 Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. Every week, you just don't know what you're going to get from these Jet wide receivers. On paper, I've said this looks like one of the better offenses in the league. Garrett Wilson, Davante Adams, Breece Hall out of the backfield. Aaron Rodgers, even though I believe Rodgers, his best days are behind him. I mean, he's off with his wide receivers. But this week, it's a pretty good matchup at the Dolphins. I don't think Jalen Ramsey is an elite as in a corner as he once was. And this week, I think Garrett Wilson could go out there and put up solid number 2 wide receiver numbers for owners. 22 Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. It was good to see Marvin have a touchdown last week in that ball game in Minnesota. I know he has 7 touchdowns on the season, but there's a lot of weeks where the numbers aren't there and it's inconsistencies. It has to do with playing with a running quarterback like Kyler Murray, and also being a rookie as well, where you got to adjust as the week goes on. So I know they want to get the football to him more. Last week they definitely did that, and this week versus Seattle, we'll see if he gets involved early and often once again is Marvin Harrison, because a couple weeks ago versus Seattle defense, he pretty much didn't do anything. 23 Calvin Ridley of the Tennessee Titans, so he's the number 1 option in the passing game for this Titan team. This week a good matchup versus his former team, the Jacksonville Jaguars, and they need time a player versus his former team. You know, they want to go out there and put up big numbers, but it wasn't like they traded him away with Jacksonville. Just Tennessee overwhelmed them with a big offer with Calvin Ridley, and he signed on with this Tennessee Titan team after they blew out Jacksonville's offer. So this week, in a matchup versus his former team, I think he could go out there and have a decent ball game. 24 Davante Adams of the New York Jets. So Davante Adams, last week he had a good game, but it seems like every couple weeks he'll have a flash game as Adams. So this week in a decent matchup at the Dolphins, where last week we saw the secondary have trouble all game long versus the Green Bay Packers, I think Adams could go out there. I know he's definitely on the decline. I know him and Aaron Rodgers, believe it or not, aren't on the same page, missing on plays where he's throwing the football one way and Adams is going the other. But this week in Miami, it's a decent matchup, and I still believe he could contribute for fantasy owners this week. 25 Darnell Mooney of the Atlanta Falcons. So Mooney definitely had a down game last week, and I believe he's still not 100%, where he tweaked that hamstring a few weeks ago in Denver before they went on bye week. So this week it's a beatable matchup in Minnesota. I know overall they're one of the better defenses in the league, but in terms of giving yards to wide receivers, they're bottom 10 in the league in that. So I think Darnell Mooney could exploit this secondary, and this is a revenge game as well for Kirk Cousins, where, you know, he wants to go out there versus his former team and put on a big ball game, and Darnell Mooney definitely a big part of this offense. 26 Juwan Jennings, the San Francisco 49ers. So Juwan Jennings, he's been solid this season for this 49er team. This week a good matchup versus the Chicago Bears, and Juwan Jennings, to be honest, I think he's been better than Brandon Ayuk was before he went out with the ACL injury, so he could run all the routes. Him and Brock Purdy have a good rapport going back years ago, playing with the second team in preseason and all training camp. And we saw it early in the year where he had a 175-yard receiving game and 3 touchdowns. So this week versus Chicago, I think he could go out there and have a good ball game. 27 Keenan Allen staying in the same game of the Chicago Bears. So Keenan Allen solid over the last couple weeks. Last week he found the end zone twice, and I think Keenan Allen's finally healthy, where coming into the year he wasn't 100% dealing with a hamstring and knee injury. And obviously those injuries nag and could obviously play a big impact on a football player's results, and where you can't cut, you can't jump, and you just lose a step. So this week at San Francisco, a matchup most likely they could be chasing points. I think Keenan Allen once again could go out there and be a decent number 2-3 option in your fantasy lineup. 28 Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Thomas Jr. last week, he had a big ball game for the Jacksonville Jaguars. They're pretty much down to the back end of their depth chart with Christian Kirk, Gabe Davis out for the season. Now Trevor Lawrence concussed, Mac Jones going to start in this one. But Mac Jones and Thomas did hit on some big plays, and he's an explosive wide receiver. So this week in a matchup at Tennessee, where this could be a grinded out game or a game where they're chasing points once again, I think Brian Thomas could go out there and have a pretty good ball game. 29 Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. So Jameson Williams, we know he's a big boom or bust wide receiver, but for the most part this season, his floor has actually been 8 or 9 fantasy points in PPR leagues. He is Jameson Williams. So he's on an explosive offense. He's the number 2 target, in my opinion, behind Amon-Ra St. Brown in the passing game, where Sam Laporta for the majority of the season is taking a back seat, even though I know last week he had 2 touchdowns. But this week versus the Packers, a secondary that is vulnerable at times to giving up big plays. I think J-Mo could go out there and possibly get that big deep ball touchdown. 30 Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. He's not 100%. He's been missed the last few games with a hamstring injury, even though he was warming up in last week's game before at the Baltimore Ravens, but he didn't give it a go. But this week versus Carolina Panthers, a good ball game for him to come back in. And Dallas Goedert now week to week with his injury, where Devonta Smith could slide right in to be easily the number 2 option in the passing game. So this week with a good matchup versus Carolina, and I think Smith was close last week to playing where he was warming up before the ball game. I think he could be a decent number 2 flex option for fantasy owners. 31, DeAndre Hopkins of the Kansas City Chiefs. So the number 2 option in the passing game is D-Hop. He's been pretty decent, I believe, for this Chief team. 3 out of the last 4 games for him, double-digit fantasy points in PPR leagues. And this week, a decent matchup versus the Los Angeles Chargers, where their secondary's had some trouble versus wide receivers over the last few weeks. So I think D-Hop, I know the ceiling isn't as high as it was going back even a few years ago, even though he's playing with Patrick Mahomes. But like I said, he's the number 2 option in the passing game. But the number 1 wide receiver on this team, 32, Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. So Jordan Addison, a pretty good matchup coming up this week versus the Falcons. A couple weeks ago, he had a monster game, 162 yards, found the end zone. And then last week, in the come-from-behind victory versus the Arizona Cardinals, he had 9.40 fantasy points. He's starting to get a little bit steady as Addison, and I believe he's finally almost 100% healthy as well, where he was dealing with some injuries early in the season. 33, Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. So Shakir, I've said this a lot this season, number 1 target, in my opinion, in this Bill offense. Any target near him, he's catching 90% of them. And even last week in the snowball game, I believe he had a decent performance. So this week on the fast track in a potential high-scoring ball game with the Rams, I think Shakir could get back and have a decent ball game this week. 34, Adam Thielen, the Carolina Panthers. Adam Thielen last season, he had a good first half of the year with Bryce Young at quarterback. And then last week we saw had 23 fantasy points in PPR leagues is Adam Thielen. And he got robbed out of a second touchdown in that ball game where he did bobble it in the back of the end zone, but I thought he gained control. That knee hit, and then he went out of bounds. But this week, a matchup with Philadelphia is definitely a tough one. But Adam Thielen easily operating as the number 1 wide receiver in this offense with Xavier Legette over there as well. But Thielen, he still can make the plays. He's still a good route runner, even though he definitely lost a step, as obviously he's at a part of his career. But in this game, if they're chasing points and a lot of preventing garbage time, I think Thielen could work his way into flex option type of numbers. 35, Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. So he's been a bust this season as Deebo, nagging injuries, not performing. And George Kittle's been that number 1 option in the passing game when healthy for this 49er team. So this week, I know on paper it's a pretty decent matchup versus the Chicago Bears that give up points to everyone this season, especially the last 6 weeks of the year where their team definitely free-falled. But this week, Deebo Samuel, you can't have trust in him. But also looking the other way, it wouldn't be surprising if he goes out there and has like 90, 100 yards and possibly finds the end zone. But with the track record this season and the nagging injuries and taking a back seat a little bit in this offense, he's definitely low on this list. And 36 and final receiver on rankings, Nick Westbrook-Ikhine of the Tennessee Titans. So he's been a big deep ball threat all season long for this Titan team. And he just has a knack for the end zone. On the season, he has 18 catches, is Westbrook-Ikhine, and 8 of them are touchdowns. So him and Will Levis are definitely hitting on big plays. He's a big play wide receiver, not going to catch a lot of balls per game, and he's not going to get a lot of targets, but it just takes one deep ball for him to have a decent ball game. And this week, in a matchup versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, a secondary that can't stop anyone, I believe Westbrook-Ikhine could go out there once again and have a decent game, but I'm not guaranteeing the touchdown. So that's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking for Week 14 of the fantasy football season.